Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Jonathan Friedman, and this is The Common Room, PEN America's weekly conversation series looking at issues of free speech, diversity, and inclusion in higher education. PEN America is a membership organization for writers, journalists, scholars, and their allies. And if you enjoy today's program, we invite you to check out our work and consider joining us in our mission to celebrate literary expression and defend civil liberties that make it possible. Today's program, a few ground rules before we get into it. The first half will be a recorded panel discussion between me and two distinguished guests. We're going to allow questions in the chat, but otherwise ask all of you in the audience to kind of listen in and take it in. In the second half, we're going to turn off the recording and open it up for an interactive opportunity for conversation. If you have questions you want to drop in the chat throughout today's hour, please do so. We'll also invite people to turn off their microphones or raise their hands to unmute their videos and raise their hands if they have a question in particular they'd like to ask directly of me or our panelists. Finally, this is a forum for interaction and for open dialogue. So I ask that everyone today speak to one another with respect and remember to mute when not speaking. So let's get into the topic at hand. We're days out from what is sure to be a tumultuous election day, election week, election month. And I know that many on campuses across the country, professors, administrators, staff are concerned, looking for opportunities and ideas, tips and best practices for helping students and helping members of their communities to have conversations, to talk to one another, and to listen. I'm delighted to be joined in today's conversation about managing political difference on the virtual campus by Sigal Ben-Porath, who is professor of education with secondary appointments in philosophy and political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Ben-Porath authored the book Free Speech on Campus, which came out in 2017 and has been doing a tour of campuses, giving advice and workshops for the past few years. Welcome, Sigal. As well, I'm delighted to be joined by Vicka Robinson, who is currently the Director of Residence Life at Miami University in Ohio. Vicka has over 17 years of experience in residence life and has encountered more than I would think her fair share of difficult conversations with students with different political ideologies, and is going to be bringing that experience to our conversation as well today. So welcome to you both. I thought I would start out by beginning with a question really to ask you to talk about your work and your advice and your expertise on this issue of how people can facilitate conversation and manage politically tense conversations. And before we shift to talking about how they do it in the virtual realm, just talking about some of the advice you offered, some of your principles and kind of go-to tips for audiences that you would have offered before the pandemic. Let's start with you, Sigal.
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's really great to be here. And I appreciate the opportunity to be to take an early part in this important series from PEN America. I would say that my general advice for people managing hard conversations on campus, both on and off, or inside and outside the classroom, has been to try and think about the places and context in which the commitment to open expression overlaps with the commitment to diversity and inclusion. So not to start off by focusing on the places where we have tensions or have to choose between protecting open expression and free inquiry on the one hand, and protecting diversity and inclusion on the other hand, which is a common way to frame the issue. Rather, instead, to try and think about the two as complementary and as two principles that really are foundational or are the two cornerstones of our work at the university, whereby under the umbrella of what I call inclusive freedom, we try to create the conditions for as many people, as many identities, and as many opinions to be voiced within the different contexts in which we operate. So trying to make sure that the inclusivity that we provide and the safe context that we provide really is open to hearing a diversity of views, in a respectful way that supports the participation of a diversity of identities and perspectives. That's sort of like my stripped down starting point for a conversation about open expression in a polarized context.
So philosophically, in other words, to kind of have in our minds not just free speech and not just kind of diversity and inclusion, but somehow to marry them together, to hold them at the same time.
Right, and to create a context where they really are able to operate simultaneously. Now, I'm not being, this is not all kumbaya, and I'm aware of that, right? So I'm not trying to paper over the context in which we face tensions, and I'm sure we'll get to those as well, and they're very important to consider. But I think starting from the perspective that we ought to try to wrap our arms around both of them at the same time in our daily work, I think is just an important starting point. And then when they clash, we look, rights and commitments and obligations oftentimes clash, and we ought to decide how to mitigate or how to reduce the tension. But broadly speaking, I think in our daily regular course of our work, we ought to try to create a space where both of them are respected at the same time and carry the same weight, right? They are not one is more important than the other, but rather both of them are foundational to our work.
So let's bring Vicka into this conversation, and kind of similar question. I know you've had numerous experiences where you had students in residence halls who, maybe they're roommates, maybe they're just in the same hallway, but they really don't see eye to eye on a range of issues. I'm just wondering, could you talk a little bit about what you have learned from so many years of experience of mediating those kinds of conflicts? What lessons help you, and help other people, help your staff ultimately resolve conflicts, engage in effective conversations?
Sure. I think that first, thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here to engage in this important conversation. I really think that we have to recognize that people just want to be sort of recognized and seen in their humanity. They want to be given sort of the dignity that they are sort of born as a birthright. And if we start there, and we are unafraid, and that doesn't mean that we don't have concerns, but that if we are unafraid of engaging in conversations that might be different than those conversations that we're used to engaging with, that might be with a population of people or perspectives that we aren't regularly exposed to. If we're not afraid to do that, I think we get better as a world. And so much of what we see on college campuses, and I don't think you have to just look at college campuses, I think we see it reflected in our national conversations, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, is about people talking to people who are already going to agree with them. And so what we see on college campuses is more opportunity for that to not occur, that you are in classes or student organizations or a residence hall, or you're in these other places where you can't just sort of go back to your corner. You're sort of forced to engage with folks who may have a different lived experience or perspective than you. And so taking, I think what we need faculty and staff to do, certainly in student life, there's a lot of staff representation, is that we have to step into that. We have to step into those moments where, because even we are, as human beings, likely to be in circles and situations where folks are agreeing with us a lot. And so even we have to recognize that we are entering into spaces with bias and with misperceptions and assumptions. And we have to sort of make sure that we're doing a good job as professionals to say, okay, this is a perspective I have, but there are many perspectives on this. And how am I doing good due diligence? How am I being an effective student affairs employee? How am I effectively serving students by recognizing that my perspective is not the only perspective, and that there's validity to multiple perspectives?
All right. So validity to multiple perspectives, holding free speech and inclusion principles at the same time. So let's pivot to talking about, the now and the moment, the virtual. Vicka, we'll start with you this time. I mean, how have you been able to transfer some of these principles that we're talking about, and kind of an alertness to the validity of diverse viewpoints and perspectives into the virtual realm in your work and the work of your staff?
Well, I think we move too fast. And I think we have a tendency to move too fast when we're face to face for real. And I think that can be amplified by being in a virtual environment. So a lot of it is just kind of slowing things down. I think the other thing that we have to do is, we enter these spaces, whether we're talking about a Zoom meeting or other virtual spaces, with an agenda of what we want to accomplish at the time. But when you are engaging with human difference, sometimes the agenda has to be thrown out and you have to just sit in the moment and engage in that difference. I think it's more important to do that when you are in a virtual space than when you are in a face-to-face space. And so I think slowing it down, being agile around the agenda of what you need to accomplish, and just sort of trying to be as human as possible in those spaces. I think that's what we really need at this time as we're engaging in a more virtual environment.
Can I try to agree and add something?
Sure.
So I really agree with you, Vicka, that it's really important to be responsive, right? And to try to um, let go of like a very structured sort of like plan, and try to slow down and see what is around us, including in the virtual context. But I want to add to that a part of this, in my view, and particularly when teaching as opposed to meetings, um, the virtual environment is oftentimes overly controlled by, for example, the host of the meeting, or in a classroom, it's the instructor. So when I teach, I can even pre-record the lecture, and so people can't respond in the moment. I can disable the chat, which sometimes is justified, right, because of various behaviors or to help people focus. But I'm basically silencing the participants in a very, strong way. I can pre-assign breakout rooms so that on the one hand, I'm abiding by what you said, Vika, before, which is like, make sure that people meet new people and consider new ideas, but at the same time it means that I'm stripping them of the opportunity to coordinate and collaborate with their friends and people who they are already familiar with, which can overcome some of the isolation of the two-dimensional sort of like world that we are in right now. So my worry about the virtual context, particularly in a classroom context, is that we give too much power and too much control over speech to the host or instructor. And that at the same time, what this does is that it really limits the opportunities for serendipity in the classroom, right? So one of the things that's most wonderful in a teaching, and also in some other contexts of facing students, whether it's advising clubs or supporting student life, or some social activities in residential life, is just this lively engagement that brings out something that you didn't plan for and didn't think about. And I'm not, I recognize that sometimes it can be an awful thing, but oftentimes it's just interesting and exciting, and takes you in a different direction. And so a part of, exactly along with what you said, Vika, about um, slowing down and so you got to also try and figure out ways, which is really hard in a virtual environment, figuring out a way to letting things happen outside of your control as the instructor or the host, and letting things unfold a little bit in their own pace and out of people's interests. I think is really the most significant way in which we learn something new. Again, whether in or out of the classroom, right? Learn something new is by saying, oh, wait, that was like not actually what we came in for, but let's think about that for a second. And we ought to be open to that.
I think when I used to teach, that was always, the more interesting parts of the class, the part where you kind of you're looking at your clock and you're thinking about how much you wanted to cover today, but the conversation is so rich and interesting. How long do you let it go on? but is that kind of shifting, in the virtual? I think it's, if anything, it's even more difficult with students tuning in from, sometimes their bedrooms or from other places. Are there ways to encourage the kind of listening where perhaps by virtue of being physically kind of together in a room, students were forced to listen to one another, and now maybe it's easier for them not to?
Yeah, I mean, I think some would argue that you can be present and not be present, and that was probably happening in our real life classrooms as well. And that, there's a lot of ways that a student can distract themselves. They look like they're there, but they're not necessarily there. I also think that as we learn more about virtual or items like Zoom or other modalities, other vendors that can be used for classroom management, there are things that we can tap into. So this idea of polling, right? So if I want students to engage, I might have them review the material beforehand. You think about inverted classrooms. I might have them review the material beforehand and submit 3 or 4 questions that would be good for polling. And then I build that into the Zoom, and then we do a poll, and then we talk a little bit about it, right? And so it's not, we don't have to. In some ways, we can gain things that aren't possible in person because we have now a virtual reality that we're working in. But it just takes really thinking about it, and it takes the willingness to engage in new technology. And not everybody inside or outside of the classroom is comfortable with that. And so we have to get ourselves comfortable with that. But Zoom has a lot of really great features, not to push Zoom too much, but a lot of really great features that encourage interactivity in a way that you have to, use Nearpod, or you have to use another vendor to do that in real life. Here it can just be built right into Zoom. And I think that's an advantage.
Right. I mean, it's true, Vicka, but I also would hope that along with that and along with what we do in the virtual environment to collaborate, that we also try to create spaces for people to reach out to each other outside of class. And I really feel like one of the biggest challenges, both to learning and also just to well-being in this particular time, is just the disconnection and the isolation that people feel. Some of our students actually live by themselves, or in a context that is not socially supportive in various ways, whether it's with their family or roommates or just solo. Um, and I think if we create opportunities, and those have to be actually substitute opportunities to the regular ones, right? To do, for example, shared work, right? So a lot of our assessment for learning is based on individual work, right? Did you do it yourself, And definitely in the spring, I saw a lot of effort and also money go into like proctoring exams to make sure that people don't cheat and don't text each other or ask each other. And even at the time, and definitely looking back, it looks pretty crazy to me, because first of all, it's so ineffectual, right? And it's so stressful. Students were so miserable about it. Universities were losing so much money over these third party, vendor proctors and the software and the people who, and students had to have their own room in order to take an exam, which is unreasonable for a lot of people. So all of this, instead of saying, look, I give up, do it in teams. I'm going to grade the team, So obviously you're going to get some, imbalanced, efforts there. I'm not ignoring that. But, that's the case anyway. And a lot of the work that we do is in teams, in the real world anyway. So I feel like if we find opportunities around assessment and assignments, but also in preparing for class, submitting questions, as you said, or submitting reflections or ideas ahead of time or after the fact, if we find opportunities to invite people, we don't have to require it, but at least to have a significant invitation for people to work in pairs or in small groups, I think it actually serves their learning. It serves the purposes of whether it's teaching and learning, and whether it's just overcoming isolation. And so it supports really our overall goals. And we should be more open to that, not in addition to, because we're piling the students up with more and more work in ways that are unreasonable, I think, for this time or other times. But if we allow for collaborative work to be a part of our expectations, I think is even more important than ever in a virtual environment.
We're going to turn in a minute to talking about the election next week and thinking about, the day after or the week after. But, just on this question of teamwork and, those of us in the audience who are teaching sometimes classes that have students, a diverse student body with students with different political orientations, certainly maybe voting differently in this election. When you're engaging or setting up kind of teams for that kind of collaboration, any skills or strategies that you think are particularly helpful for preventing it from just deteriorating into conflict, disagreement, and then you're dealing with a set of projects that haven't progressed to any kind of completion.
I, so I so I think one thing when you're whether you're talking about inside or outside of the classroom, but particularly when you're talking about inside of the classroom, I think one of the things that you can do is assign a dissenter. And so that gives permission for someone to disagree with whatever the group is saying. And that might be an opinion they hold, or it might be an opinion they don't hold, but it introduces this idea that like not everybody's going to agree, and that's okay. And we know that teams that are diverse, we know that teams that have a variety of perspectives on them are going to perform better than teams that or everyone's thinking the same. So just introducing that, normalizing that. So today you're the dissenter, today you're the dissenter, whatever, and that way it's like, oh, okay, well, my job is to disagree. And again, maybe those are opinions that you hold, and maybe those are opinions that you don't hold. When I'm having group discussions, I'll say, like somebody will say something that I know is very polarizing. And I'll say, what might a person who disagrees with that say? And that gives students the opportunity that if they disagree to say, a person who may or may not be me could think this about that's been said, right? And if it's, sometimes you have people who are more talkative than others, and so it might be a person who really does agree but now is thinking about what a different perspective might be. I think those are some ways to do that.
And you've given them the space to do that.
Yeah, these are amazing ideas, I think, because this is really useful, especially, the structured opportunities to bring into the classroom or into the conversation a greater diversity of opinion, I think is really central, particularly when we know that in some classrooms, in some institutions, in some disciplines or departments, we have more and more homogeneity of opinion. It's not always what you'd expect. I mean, it's oftentimes different in the English department than it is in the economics department, right? But still you see a lot of coalescing of opinion in various classrooms. And sometimes that means that you will just not have any dissenters, or it would mean that you would have them, but they would be uncomfortable raising their voices, which basically is a disservice to them as learners, but it's also a disservice to everyone who is unable to hear an alternative voice. So I think if you create, as you just suggested, a structured opportunity to raise this alternative voice and perspective, is really important. The one person from the University of Alaska was telling about that I heard was telling about how they have the 5 minutes rule. I don't know if you know about that, Vicka, which is that in any classroom that, basically in any classroom around the university, a person can call 5 minutes, and that would be either a student or an instructor. And they would say, I think this particular point of view that I'm mentioning has not been given any airtime here. And so whether it's their own opinion or just an opinion that they want to hear an argument about, and so then the clock starts for 5 minutes for people to represent the best argument for that particular perspective. And then the conversation can move forward. So 5 minutes you can give up before you go onwards with your class lesson. And I think it's a really, similar to what you said about dissenters, right? It's a structured opportunity to speak across, whether it's political divides, ideological divides, or other divides in perspective that, otherwise are either invisible or silenced, or are just, deteriorating into blaming each other. I just want to say one other thing, which is a recommendation that I give to students when we're having hard conversations about sensitive topics like the elections, or some policy discussions. I try to always say focus on judgment and not on intention, right? So don't try to talk about, your intention is mean, or you would like to hurt me, or you disrespect me, or don't try to interpret a person's intention and don't vilify it. Try to think about their judgment. How are they judging the circumstances or the policy or whatever it might be? And maybe you think their judgment is misguided and wrong and you want to argue against it, right? But this way you don't have to assume what the other person has in their heart. You can focus on their words, and that makes it just easier to have a productive conversation.
I think that's exactly right. And, very good advice as we head into, what's going to be a very difficult period, regardless of the outcomes of the election. Some group of students on campuses, in classrooms, in residence life, they are probably going to be, dismayed by however this is resolved. And, I wanted to just kind of run by, just a scenario for you both, which is that moment that many professors or others who are facilitating conversations face, when nobody is talking, nobody wants to take that kind of first step. People are very aware that there are third rails here, and the political, I don't know, repercussions of speaking out, of speaking freely, of raising a controversial topic are so high. How do you negotiate that scenario?
I mean, I really do. I don't want to, I'm going to repeat myself. But I really do think it's about normalizing the fact that there are a variety of perspectives, and that we want to, whatever space we're all sharing together, we want to acknowledge that there are a variety of perspectives. And whether you hold whatever we're talking about, the perspective that you're sharing or not, I mean, I think it goes to the previous point that it's about, let's make sure that there's space, and let's make sure that everyone has an opportunity to really think about all the variety of ways, particularly on a college campus, all of the variety of ways of how a particular situation, scenario, political belief, whatever, all of the ways that it really could make sense. So you're maybe you're sitting, and I'll use, since we're talking about politics, I'll talk about the left and the right. So maybe you're squarely on the left. Well, let's talk about why somebody would be on the right. And the validity in that perspective, and vice versa. And we don't have to agree. We just want to understand that there are a variety of perspectives and that there is legitimacy in each of those perspectives. I think where we sort of get it wrong is that we want to be right. We want this to be the only way that anybody can ever view something. And that's just, it's not real. That's not how it works. It's complex. I had a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about abortion. And he was like, well, I don't understand. A friend, I tell you, this person's a friend. Because sometimes I tell this story and people are like, wow, that sounds really, but no, we're friends. We're still friends. We had this conversation. And he said, I don't understand how you can, identify this way and identify this way. And I just looked at him, I said, it's complex. like I don't have a good answer. Like it is, what I can tell you is that's real for me. And I get why it would be confusing for you, but it's confusing for me too. And so, and he was like, oh, I guess that's I guess that makes sense, right? Like, and so I think we expect there to be an outcome, an end game. And the reality is that as human beings, we're constantly growing and developing and learning and changing and moving and doing all those things. And so just acknowledging that, I think, is important when we're talking about whatever happens next week. And I think, Jonathan, you're right, that regardless of the outcome, I think there are people who are going to feel really great. And I think there are people who are going to feel really bad. And those are not small numbers. I think it's going to feel like a lot of people who feel one way or the other. And so how are we on college campuses grappling with that, on whatever the results might
Right. Yeah, no, that's perfectly true, I think. And it seems to me like one of the ways that we can overcome the kind of silence or reluctance to participate, Jonathan, that you started the question off with, um, as I think was evident from Vicka's response, is to try to start with testimonials, right? To try to start with where I stand, right? So instead of making sort of like grand statements about visions or about ideological preferences, to say, look, here is where I come from. Here is me, Sigal, with my experiences or identities or preferences. Here is where I am. You know what? Here is where I am today, this morning, in this class. Here is how I'm feeling. Here is my concern or my sense of promise or hope, right? So to start small and with what I bring to the table, whether it's my strengths or my vulnerability or my knowledge or contribution, right? Or something I hope to gain. So I think when you start with testimonials, it's really easier to take a first step and connect with others and have a more productive conversation.
Well, what about that situation where you have that one student who's, the outlier in the room? Maybe there's one, maybe there's two, but it's very clear that they view things unlike other students in the class. How do you, as a professor or facilitator of dialogue and, just very relevant after the election, protect that person and their views without necessarily, I don't know, endorsing them or sharing them yourself?
Right. I mean, in classrooms that are not very diverse in certain senses, right? When you have an outlier, and the outlier may be an outlier of ideology or of identity, or sometimes both, right? Um, it's definitely complicated, and I don't think it's always possible. To be honest, after 2016, in some classrooms it was possible, and in other classrooms it wasn't. A colleague of mine was telling me about the teaching at an institution where many of her students were elated after the 2016 elections, and most of them were white students. And she said that the two people in class who were people of color, two people in a class of 60 students, did not want to go into the class that was celebrating, after the 2016 elections. They just asked her to be excused. And she in the moment, right, as she's walking into class, she understood that they were just not feeling comfortable sort of like sharing in the group like this, even as they were just going to continue on focusing on the topics of the day in the syllabus, right? So sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. And I think you have to recognize your own limitations in these circumstances, right? Or that you can't reach everyone, but not that you can't reach everyone, broadly speaking, but in a certain moment you can't always wrap your arms around every single person in the room and do it effectively. But I think overall what we need to prepare ourselves for is just the recognition that people are going to have strong and diverse emotional responses, and that we have to make some room for that, but really try to focus on what we can learn and what we can do, right? So these are sort of like the goals of our shared engagement on campus, is what we can learn and what we can do. And if we can focus on those in some productive way, I think we did something. And I'd hope that this is a way that is forward, that is possible for many instructors. But when emotions are very raw, it's not always possible.
Now we talk about this idea. If you can imagine sort of a bullseye, that in the center of that bullseye is your comfort zone, and the next ring is your learning zone, and then the outer ring is your panic zone. If somebody is in their panic zone, they can't learn anything. So that's not the time to try to teach them because they're in their panic zone. You want to get them out of their panic zone and into their learning zone, and then you can start to engage in conversation. I think the other thing to note is that your response is your responsibility. And so I think sometimes I'll say where we made a mistake. I think there were two key mistakes in 2016. There were lots of mistakes, but there were two key mistakes in 2016. The first is that we were completely not anticipating anything. And so because we were not anticipating on college campuses anything, we were unprepared to respond in any way. And then the response really did come across as sort of an endorsement of the what I'll put in quotations, the liberal agenda, right? Oh my gosh, look at this thing. And then of course that leaves conservative students feeling some kind of way about their campus or campus leadership, all their professors, right? And in many ways, sort of confirms what is already believed to be a liberal bias on college campuses. So to not be prepared, I think is a huge mistake. And now I'm totally forgetting the second mistake. Let's see if it comes back to me. Oh, the second mistake is that we did not make the response the responsibility of the student. We made the response the responsibility of the administration and of the professors. And your response is your responsibility. And so if I am, regardless of how it rolls out on Tuesday, if on Wednesday I feel like I can't do something, that's my responsibility to take whatever precautions I feel like I need to, and to take whatever reactions I feel like I need to. So if somebody comes to me, and I teach on Monday, so this won't be an issue for me. But for people that teach on Wednesday, if somebody comes to me and says, oh my gosh, I'm just so devastated, I can't come to class. I'm like, well, you were supposed to be there. So you're free to make that choice, that this is not an environment that you can be in, but there might be, and I don't want to use the word consequences, but there are outcomes to making that choice. And that's part of adulthood. The reality is that there's a lot of college campus privilege to choose what you're not going to engage in that does not exist outside of a college campus. And we are, I would argue, doing our students no favors by what some would call coddling them in those moments that are difficult. I can't just decide I'm not going to work. I have to go do what I'm supposed to do on Wednesday, regardless of what happens on Tuesday. And if I choose not to do what I'm supposed to do on Wednesday, that's still my choice, but there are outcomes related to that choice. And I think we made that mistake in 16.
I mean, do you think, I think this is a real question, though, for professors. If you have a group of students who are asking to be, let out of class, or, I can't continue, I'm a little distracted, I think being sensitive to that panic zone that you talked about is, important. To me, it's a judgment call. And I know it's going to sound like, evading a question for a minute, but, I don't think there are necessarily universal answers. I think it is part of a professor or teacher or leader's role to understand where people are coming from, why the world today is hitting them the way it is, and to be sensitive to that, to be kind of understanding and empathetic with that. And maybe there isn't a one size fits all answer.
I totally agree. I totally agree that there isn't a one size fits all answer. So if I am a student and I have 5 classes and I communicate to all 5 of my professors how I'm feeling that day and I can't engage, I have to be ready for some professors to say, okay, you can go ahead and make up the work and it won't count. And in COVID, I don't know that anybody's counting absences, but whatever. But there also might be another professor that says, I expect to see you here at 3 o'clock. And students have to be comfortable with the reactions. There cannot be a presumed reaction. Because I'm having this experience, the world needs to change around me. That's not how it works. And so you might find that the world has changed around you in class A, but it hasn't changed around you in class B, and we need to be prepared for that. So I absolutely agree with you that it's nuanced, but we have to prepare students for that nuance.
So my last question here before we open it up to questions really is about, how we can reckon with our own political biases in these moments. I, might vote one way. I have students who vote another way. How do I avoid in how, I might manage the conversation the day after the election in ways that are fair or equal or inclusive, sensitive to students from different backgrounds?
I mean, I just want to go back to what Vicka said before, which is that we need to remember that these are large numbers. These are not margins, right? So people there are, there are two large options in this country, right? Uh, and some smaller ones, right? So for people who are politically engaged, which is more and more young people, there's going to be two typical reactions, right? Very happy and very sad, right? And we have to be able to make room for both of them, independent of which of them we fall under personally, right? I feel like, and it's not just that I feel like, I encounter some people who voice the perspective, by some people, I mean faculty, and administrators on college campuses, who voice the perspective that their own view is the only legitimate view that should be made acceptable in their classroom or in their context. It's not very common as it's portrayed, but it definitely is, one view that is voiced. If you're on the other side, you're illegitimate. And I think this is misguided. I think that as strongly as I hold my belief, other people may hold their beliefs, including my students, and it's my responsibility to make room for them. First of all, because whatever I do, even if I think that they are, their judgment is completely wrong, they are part of this country, and they, are legitimately voting and voicing their opinions, and it doesn't make sense. And I think it's unfair and potentially illegal for me to silence them. But I also think that, if you are involved in educating people, whether it's through teaching or involvement in other, other aspects of campus life, if you're involved in educating people and you don't believe that they can change, and you don't allow them to grow, and you don't consider anyone's belief, but especially a young person's belief, as a temporary thing, evolving thing, part of their growth, maybe they will hold on to it forever. Maybe they're trying it out. Maybe that's how they were raised, and they can still grow and change. If you silence them, you're not allowing them to basically grow and consider their perspectives, right? And so I think both for practical reasons, learning reasons, and also for all sorts of other public and social and legal reasons, we have to make sure that whether we voice our own opinions and or and biases, or whether we keep them to ourselves, and I think both are legitimate choices, we ought to be clearly making the point to allow room for a diversity of opinions in our classrooms, diversity of legitimate opinions. Look, there are going to be extreme views that I'm not going to welcome in my class, but I mean, when you talk about like party affiliation or happiness or sadness about the results, I don't think you can silence those. It doesn't make sense.
Vicka, anything to add on that one?
I mean, our job on college campuses is to educate students. And that's our job. That's our job when we agree with them. That's our job when we don't. And we have to remember that. And we can lose our way. I think, I won't speak for student affairs, but I think it's part of why I've gotten into this work is that there can be a lot of space between student affairs folks, residence life folks, and I'll just call it students who have a conservative ideology. There can be a lot of space, and that space is inappropriate because we're supposed to be there to serve all of our students, to work with all of our students. So whether a student agrees with me or not, my job is to work with all of our students. I also think take out whatever the identity is that you're struggling with and put in one with you have less struggle, and think about how your reaction would be if someone were treating this student, whether it's a Black student or a queer student or whoever, how are they treating this student compared to how you're treating a student who maybe has an identity you don't see eye to eye with? And is that okay? And it's absolutely not. I mean, I don't even need people to answer that question. That's not okay. So if it's not okay to treat a Black student a certain way because they're a Black student, it's not okay to treat a conservative student a certain way because they're a conservative student. That resonates with people. That's been helpful. So those are my thoughts.
I think there's a lot of caricature that we see and stereotyping. But indeed, you can have those outliers on either side of the today's political spectrum. I can rewind the clock to 5 or 6 years ago, teaching a class where the outlier in that class was actually someone who today I can recognize was trying to bring into the conversation perspectives from critical race theory, but she was very much an outlier in that room in that time, which might not be the case now, but I think it can be the conservative students or perhaps students on the progressive left. Well, I want to thank you both for your conversation, for the contributions.